Kenny Mason just released a new album called Ruffs, and I think this one's pretty solid. Like, I wasn't really a big Kenny Mason fan, but I tried to listen to the song Nosedive featuring Jean Dawson because I'm a big Jean Dawson fan, and I really like that one. And although the rest of the album isn't as good as that one, I still think this is a really solid album. Kenny Mason is super versatile and just is a really interesting guy to listen to. Let's start it off with the first one, Zoomies. I really like the beat in this one, and I feel like just Kenny Mason on this entire album, really good at with the flow, really good with like flow changes and voice changes. And he just sounds really good over the whole thing, but there are some things that kind of hold him back. But let's go back to this first one, Zoomies. I feel like the beat is pretty solid, but it's kind of a little bit too much in the background because I feel like it does sound pretty good. Kenny's flow is really good, and he sounds really good, especially when the beat starts hitting. When he changes his flow, it also sounds pretty good, especially when like his voice kind of like bounces around your headphones. Then we go to Halos. The beat is pretty angelic and kind of starts building up to eventual crescendo, which kind of sounds like, a Halo, even in a sense of doom, but then it has kind of like a boom bap production, and he sounds, really good with the flow again, and the beat switches, but the sample stays, so it kind of really flows perfectly in between the two. But, I really like that one. Then we go to number 3, Halloween. The song has a more like guitar sounding beat, and I like the way Kenny uses his voice to like make it layered and to give each voice kind of a different distortion to make it sound like there are multiple people on one track when it's really just him. And the slower part at the end is also pretty solid, and it kind of slows the song down for a transition. And the next one is a little bit more slower in terms of dip. This one's a lot more low key and is a step back in terms of vibe. I don't really like this one. I feel like it just doesn't really fit the vibe of the rest of the album. But it does show off Kenny's talents of changing up the flow and his voice to, showcase his talents. But, I didn't really like this one. Then we go to Minute Forever. The beat is, in my opinion, really cool. And it's in its own little direction, sounding similar to more of an industrial sound with, like, Autumn's antagonist. And I like how Kenny just uses his voice in different, styles to fit the beat. Then we go to Double Up. I like the, kind of chill vibe with the beat, and the repetition of Double Up in like a different voice when he's saying it kind of keeps him saying Double Up like fresh every time, and, I guess chill. And I feel like his voice just works so well with the beat there. So, it sounds really nice. Then we go to RX. I don't really like Amindi's voice. I think that's how you say it. And it's just a little bit too high pitched for the song. I'm not really a big fan of high pitched stuff on like a a regular rap beat. Doesn't really work. And while Kenny's performance is also solid, it just doesn't sound as good because he pushes a high pitched voice to match a Mindy. But either way, I don't think this song's terrible. I just think it's probably one of the worst ones on the album. Then we go to Spin and Flip. The song starts off with Nudie setting the vibe with the beat and giving Kenny kind of a new like style or production to sound on. And I feel like Nudie does sound good. Kenny really sounds good, but Nudie is just a little bit mixed in low is what I'd say, or he just sounds like, below the beat, I guess. It doesn't sound the same as Kenny's part, so, I don't really know. I don't really like that part. But I feel like if Nudie actually fit like Kenny's thing, it would sound so good, and if it was mixed in the same way. I don't really know how it works, but it doesn't really sound that good. Or as good as it could have been. We go to Mama Don't Know. Kenny kind of comes in with a whole new flow, and even though there are some like high-pitched voices which don't really work, I feel like he sounds good on the beat for most of the song, and his flow and voice sound, good like it is on this entire album. And we go to Nosedive. This is such a good song. It's just coming in. It's just a shot of dopamine directly into your veins, coming in with a super, industrial sound. And he just comes in so aggressively. He comes inside of you so aggressively. And then the change of flows and his chorus just all sound so good. And he's like stacking his vocals on top of each other. And then the beat changes for Jean Dawson's part. But it kind of works. It just is a little bit too much of the slowdown. But then it goes back into the super aggressive part. And I think Jean sounds really good. And just overall, it's just a song that gives you a ton of dopamine. It makes you want to punch through a wall or something. Then we go to 333 Adam. I feel like this one has a more industrial sounding beat as well, but he's a lot more laid back with a solid flow, and the first half of the song sounds good, and then there's kind of a transition in the second half, and I feel like it's pretty seamless as well. Kenny does really good with the choosing of the beats And this one really is really good, and I think he just sounds pretty good on it with the flow, the voice. I feel like that's a really common theme on this entire album. Then we go to Boa. I feel like he sounds pretty good over a chill beat, and uses his vocal talents to kind of soften up the song a little bit and take it away from just like the flow and the voice part. On this album, I wasn't really looking into like the lyrics, and even on the parts where I was, they didn't seem that like deep, but it does sound like he's like just a really good artist, and he knows how to use his voice and flow more than the lyrics, even though there could have been some like deeper lyrics. But either way, that one also sounds pretty good and kind of shows his talents of using his voice and flow to make a song sound really good. Then we go to Givenchy Bag. This one is pretty solid and the beat hits when you need it to, but it is kind of generic in the context of the album, and Kenny's flow and voice changes still sound pretty good. It kind of works, but I wouldn't say it's my favorite song on the album. Then we go to Blackheart. I don't really like the super low-key sounding voice, especially with his voice being toned down and not really sounding like a main part of the track. Like it kind of likes his voice is kind of below the beat, or it's probably at the same level, but there's also a vocal sample in the beat. So I feel like those kind of compete with each other over the course of the track, which I don't really like, but it's up to whoever if you want to say that's a bad thing or not, but I didn't really like it. Then we go to Shell. Kenny's voice sounds pretty good over a really good beat. I feel like this is a more chill one, but Kenny does put in a solid performance with all of the flows. I really like the sample he used, and it sounds good as a contrast. Like the sample is a nice contrast from Kenny's actual voice, and I feel like it's more like, I don't know, angelic, I guess, than the rest of the songs. Last up, it's like West Side. I don't really like the beat. It kind of sounds more like XXXTentacion acoustic guitar stuff, which I wouldn't say I'm the biggest fan of, and I feel like it doesn't really fit Kenny, but it kind of does work in the end. I just feel like it isn't really a vibe this album should have been going for, especially at the end. I guess, maybe if the next one is more like that, it could kind of make sense, but like a more raw sounding like acoustic guitar EP could work for Kenny, but just on this album, it doesn't really make sense as the last song and kind of something to close out. Just overall, my thoughts on this album is it is a really good album. Kenny is probably one of the more unique sounding artists. He has a ton of different flows, a ton of different voices, and he sounds really good over this entire album. I just feel like it's not as concise as maybe I would have wanted it to be. But either way, there's so much talent coming from this guy. I could see an amazing project from him coming out later. But even though there are the super standout tracks like Nosedive with Jean Dawson, which I feel like is probably as close to a 10 out of 10 track as I've gotten in this like entire album. It's such a good track. But besides that one, there's not really any super big standouts. And if that was kind of like just the whole album, it would be, a lot sicker. And I feel like when it is an album that's 16 tracks, 46 minutes, maybe he could have cut a track or two that didn't really fit the vibe of the album, especially West Side. I feel like that being the last track isn't the greatest, but I still think this is a really solid album. Kenny has a ton of versatility, and I'm going to give this one a 7 out of 10. I really like this one. There just were a couple parts that I didn't like that much.